Around 5,000 years ago,
The ancient Egyptians were at the height of their magnificent civilization, constructing wonders that would define human ingenuity for millennia.
and I'm sure if you made a list right now, you could name many of their achievements.
You'd probably write down the Great Pyramids, the beautiful hieroglyphs, the intricate temples, and of course, the Great Sphinx.
But just imagine for a second. What if the Great Sphinx was, as some scholars suggest, much older than we thought?
It's not hard to see why this idea is so controversial. Mainstream Egyptologists confidently date the Sphinx to around 2500 BCE, during the reign of the Pharaoh Khafre. The traditional view ties the Sphinx directly to the Giza Pyramids. Suggesting an older date challenges not only this established narrative, but also raises questions about who could have built it if not the Egyptians. On top of this, it can be seen as downright offensive to take away an undeniable marvel of the ancient world from the people who have always been credited with its creation. For some, it feels like erasing a vital piece of Egyptian cultural identity and attributing it to a hypothetical, unknown civilization, a narrative that's uncomfortably reminiscent of the colonial attitudes that have long plagued archaeology.
However, despite this, some scholars, such as Robert Schoch, have laid out evidence suggesting the Sphinx could predate this era by thousands of years.
Schoch's argument is based on the patterns of erosion seen on the Sphinx's body and the surrounding enclosure. He claims that these patterns are more consistent with water erosion than wind or sand, indicating that the Sphinx may have been carved during a period where the region experienced significant rainfall, likely before 7000 BCE, possibly as far back as 10,000 BCE, and long before the rise of the Egyptian dynasties. This raises a second major controversy. If the Sphinx is older than the Egyptian civilization, it implies the existence of a previously unknown, advanced culture capable of building such a monument. That idea shakes the very foundations of archaeology and human history, calling into question the timeline of human development.
If true, this theory would completely rewrite the history of ancient civilizations and force us to rethink what we know about humanity's past. But it's also been heavily criticized, with many labeling it as conspiracy or pseudoscience. So, is it just an outlandish theory, or is there something to this?
The idea that the Great Sphinx of Giza might be far older than conventional history suggests didn't arise in a vacuum. It's the result of decades of curious observation, geological study, and debate. It all began in the early 20th century, when Émile Baraize, a French archaeologist and engineer, led extensive restoration work on the Great Sphinx between 1925 and 1936. During this period, he completely cleared the sand from around the Sphinx, revealing its full structure for the first time since Thutmose IV's excavation in ancient times. While Baraize's primary focus was on preservation, his work inadvertently highlighted the monument's significant erosion patterns. These observations later contributed to debates regarding the Sphinx's age and the causes of its weathering. Fast forward to the late 20th century, when American geologist Robert Schoch brought the debate firmly into the spotlight. Schoch, a professor at Boston University, was invited to study the Sphinx in the early 1990s. What he found shocked him. The weathering pattern on the Sphinx's body and enclosure didn't match those caused by wind and sand, which dominate the modern Sahara Desert. Instead, he said, they bore the hallmark of water erosion, patterns formed by sustained rainfall over thousands of years.
Schoch's conclusions pointed to a startling possibility. The Sphinx might date back to a period where the Giza Plateau experienced significant rainfall, potentially as far back as 7000 to 9000 BCE. This would place its construction in a time long before the rise of the Egyptian civilization, traditionally thought to have started around 3100 BCE.
And Schoch wasn't alone in his observations. Before him, in the 1980s, independent researcher John Anthony West had already speculated that the Sphinx was much older, citing evidence of weathering that mainstream Egyptologists had largely overlooked. West's collaboration with Schoch gave his hypothesis more scientific credibility, and their findings were presented in documentaries and academic circles, sparking global interest and controversy.
Supporters of this hypothesis point to several key factors, which I will now outline.
Firstly, they argue that the erosion patterns on the limestone enclosure are consistent with prolonged water runoff, such as heavy rainfall over an extended period. These patterns differ from wind-blown sand erosion, which typically creates horizontal striations or pitting rather than vertical fissures. Schoch's analysis emphasizes that the rounded weathering is characteristic of water erosion, not desert conditions. Secondly, during the early Holocene period, roughly 9000 to 5000 BCE, the Sahara was a lush green landscape with heavy rainfall. If the Sphinx dates to this time, it would be concurrent with the water erosion shock and others claim is visible. Thirdly, they argue the erosion on the Sphinx is more pronounced and rounded than the nearby pyramids or other 4th dynasty monuments, which show mainly wind erosion and sand abrasion. They say this discrepancy suggests the Sphinx is significantly older, as it would have been exposed to weathering forces not experienced by the other structures. Next, they argue that the head and neck were remodeled from a prior sculpture to create the face of the Great Sphinx sometime during the Old Kingdom. The head of the Sphinx is significantly smaller in proportion to its body, suggesting that the original head may have been larger and was recarved into its current form. They argue that the body shows much more erosion than the head, implying the head was altered after the body was already weathered. They propose that the original head may have been a lion or another animal, and point to pre-dynastic and early dynastic artifacts which frequently depict lions as symbols of power and kingship. The Sphinx pose closely resembles these early depictions, reinforcing the idea of an original lion-like form. Mihit, a lioness goddess symbolizing protection and divine authority, was a key figure in early Egyptian religion. A monument like the Sphinx may have originally represented Mihit. This suggests the Sphinx's lion-like form could have predated its Old Kingdom reimagining, connecting it to Egypt's earliest religious traditions. On top of this, proponents argue that the Sphinx's alignment relates to the constellation Leo, a lion, which didn't align with Egypt during the mainstream date in the 4th dynasty, but would have risen on the horizon during the precessional cycle around 10,500 BCE. This aligns with the wetter climatic period and supports the idea of an earlier construction date tied to astronomical significance. Additionally, without the head, there are no explicit inscriptions or symbols that link the Sphinx to Khafre or the 4th dynasty. And finally, a stele discovered near the Giza Plateau appears to describe the Sphinx as existing during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu, predating Khafre. The stele mentions that Khufu restored the Sphinx rather than constructing it, implying it was already ancient during his reign.
Now, I hope you're still with me because that was a lot. But it is an interesting thought experiment, and I think there's some valid points in there. However, of course, this idea has come under intense criticism. So now we need to look at why this idea is so controversial.
Despite the allure of an older Sphinx, mainstream scholars have presented strong counter-arguments to maintain the traditional timeline. They argue the Sphinx is directly linked to Khafre's pyramid complex. No tools, artifacts, or cultural remains predating the 4th dynasty have ever been found in association with the Sphinx or its enclosure. They argue that if the Sphinx predates 2500 BCE by thousands of years, evidence of an earlier culture should be present. Robert Schoch's water erosion theory has also faced significant criticism. Many geologists argue that the rounded grooves and weathering patterns could be the result of wind, sand, and limited rainfall over thousands of years. The Sphinx's enclosure, being partially sheltered, may have experienced unique weathering conditions that don't necessarily imply heavy rainfall from an earlier era. Similar erosion patterns are also observed in other Old Kingdom monuments and quarries in the Giza Plateau that are securely dated to Khafre's reign, although these monuments were built from blocks quarried from the Sphinx enclosure. The Sphinx's style also matches Old Kingdom aesthetics, specifically its head and its integration into Khafre's architectural complex. Furthermore, the dream stele of Pharaoh Thutmose IV references the Sphinx and attributes it to an earlier Egyptian ruler, not an unknown civilization. This ties the Sphinx firmly to Egyptian history, even if its exact construction date is debated.
And then there's the sheer controversy of this idea.
For over a century, the Sphinx has been confidently attributed to the Old Kingdom. This theory fits neatly into Egypt's historical timeline. Proposing a much older date disrupts this narrative and forces historians to reconsider everything from Egypt's architectural history to its cultural timeline. If the Sphinx predates Egypt's dynasties, it implies the existence of a sophisticated advanced civilization capable of constructing monumental works thousands of years before Egypt. This would completely upend mainstream archaeology, which views humans of that era as hunter-gatherers, not master builders. On top of this isn't just academic, it's cultural. For Egyptians, the Sphinx is a powerful symbol of national heritage, tied to their ancestors' ingenuity. Suggesting it was built by an unknown pre-Egyptian civilization risks being seen as erasing a vital piece of Egypt's identity and achievements. Finally, some argue that attributing the Sphinx to a lost civilization aligns too closely with pseudoscientific theories, like those of Atlantis or extraterrestrial builders. Critics claim that such ideas not only lack hard evidence, but also divert attention from the very real accomplishments of the ancient Egyptians.
Now, these are all very valid criticisms, and it's important that we don't just immediately jump to the conclusion that the Sphinx is older than we thought, despite the obvious allure of that idea. But let's just imagine for a second, what if this theory is correct? What if the water erosion hypothesis is right, and the Great Sphinx is far older than we think?
The implications would be staggering. For starters, it would rewrite the timeline of human history. If the Sphinx predates the Egyptian civilization, it means that an advanced culture capable of monumental construction existed thousands of years earlier than we ever imagined. This forgotten civilization might have possessed architectural, organizational, and artistic skills far ahead of its time. It would also force us to reconsider what we think we know about early humans. Were they simply hunter-gatherers during this era, or is there a missing chapter of history where they achieved feats of engineering and knowledge we're yet to fully uncover? Proponents point to Göbekli Tepe in Turkey as a site that displays evidence of huge megalithic structures built by pre-agricultural societies that completely shifted our understanding of the capabilities of hunter-gatherer communities in organizing and constructing complex monumental architecture. And then there's the cultural impact. If the Sphinx was built by a lost civilization, how did their knowledge vanish? And could other monuments from this time be hiding in plain sight, waiting to be discovered?
Ultimately, if this theory is correct, the Sphinx becomes far more than just a wonder of the ancient world. It becomes a symbol of how much we still don't know about our own origins. It truly is a tantalizing possibility that has the potential to change everything. And despite circumstantial archaeological and Egyptological evidence dating the creation of the Great Sphinx to the 4th dynasty, there is no unequivocally conclusive evidence of when or by whom it was carved. That being said, there is also no definitive proof that it is older than accepted either. So, what do you think? Is humanity ready for what the Sphinx might reveal? Or is it just conspiracy theory nonsense? Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel.